Okay, we are partway through looking at the Westminster Larger Catechism's treatment of the Sabbath, the Lord's Day. Pardon me. Last week we looked at the wording of the commandment itself, and then the duties that are required by the fourth commandment, and what is involved in keeping the Lord's Day holy. So we looked at that. That was question 117. And now we're going to finish up the rest of the questions devoted to the Lord's Day. Today we'll work through them with all deliberate speed. So I hope we can get everything done today that we need to get done. We start out with question 118, which is on page 262 of the hardback version. And again, if you don't have the little creeds and confession, it's on pages 954 and 955 of the Trinity Psalter hymnal, 954 and 955. So we turn our attention to question 118. Why is the charge of keeping the Sabbath more specially directed to governors of families and other superiors? And the answer is the charge of keeping the Sabbath is more specially directed to governors of families and other superiors because they are bound not only to keep it themselves, but to see that it be observed by all those that are under their charge, and because they are prone oftentimes to hinder them by employments of their own. Last week we considered the fact that the keeping of one day out of 7 as a day of rest is a global requirement. The Sabbath was made for man, so it is universal in its application. But this question looks at a specific group to whom the commandment can be applied, and that being people in positions of responsibility. Heads of households, employers, supervisors. And so if you are responsible for other people, and not only are you required to keep the Sabbath yourself, but you're to make sure that those in your charge, under your responsibility, keep it as well. I think the reason that this has lent particular emphasis in the Catechism has to do with the nature of those who are in responsibility, maybe being reluctant to exercise that responsibility in the way that they should. And that's one element. And the other element, especially when we're talking about bosses, supervisors, employers, is the nature of our culture to emphasize occupation, career, and that's nothing new. Let's try a little exercise here to demonstrate this point. I'm going to write the names of some very common family names. Now, these are last names that are very common. We could all name people, remember people that we've known by these names. What do all three of these names have in common? Yes? They're all related to professions. And so probably the most common place where we get our last names are place names. Joe River, the guy that lives by the river. But these relate to what people did as an occupation. A smith, a miller. Do you know what a cooper is? Yeah, a guy that makes barrels. Yeah, not exactly a growth market these days, but it was very important in the past. But that shows you, though, doesn't it, the extent to which what we do, our occupations, define who we are. And for that reason, the framers of the Catechism wanted to lend emphasis. They realized that that's in us, that's what drives us often, that career, that job. And so we have to counter that with making sure that not only we ourselves, but those who work with us or under us take a high view of the Sabbath, to make sure that the job isn't everything, that the job is not what defines us. And particularly for Christians, for believers, our job must not be allowed to define us, because our position in Christ is what defines us. That we are God's people first, and we are a smith or a miller second. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Heads of households, same type of situation. You're responsible for those under you, and so there is a requirement here that is emphasized in the Catechism, not only for you to keep the Lord's Day holy, but to make sure that those in your family keep the Lord's Day holy. Now, this is presented positively and negatively. The positive way is that you can set an example, that if you show your employees or your children that you have a high view of the Sabbath, then chances are that they will as well. But the negative aspect of this is that you must not allow yourself, even if you observe the Sabbath, to make it difficult or indeed impossible for those under your charge to also keep the Sabbath. So that would not be a healthy situation. I wanted to lend particular emphasis here to parents, that how you view the Lord's Day will influence how your children view the Lord's Day. And I heard a celebrated teacher, author, someone whose name, if I mentioned it, probably all of you would recognize, so I'm not going to mention it, but he was talking one time about child discipline and about the need to be wise and flexible in your application of discipline to your children. No problem there. But he gave as an example that on Sundays, they had to be careful not to be too strict with their children, especially by the end of the day, because they were so busy on Sunday doing activities that by the end of the day, their kids were exhausted and starting to fall apart, so they couldn't be too strict with them. Well, what? Is he not missing the point there? Is something not going astray there? That he should be helping his children not be exhausted on the Lord's Day. So that's one example. Another example, and this is becoming increasingly common, I'm afraid, is in the history of Christ PCA before the merger. This is many years ago. There was a family with children who were members of this church, and it was observed that their attendance at Sunday morning worship was becoming irregular. And when they were queried, why is your family not in Sunday morning worship? They said that they had enrolled their children in a youth soccer league, and that the games were on Sunday morning. Now, question 118 applies directly to that type of situation, does it not? That as the head of the household, the father should have been more concerned about having his children in worship than out on a soccer, what do they call it, a pitch? Is that what they call where soccer is played? But anyway, that I would submit that the tragedy there is that those children are growing up with a deformed view of what it means to observe the Lord's Day, arguably the most important day of the week. So you see the thrust here. You see the thrust of question 118 is that if you are in a position of responsibility, if you are the head of a household with children, if you are an employer, then you're responsible not only for observing the Lord's Day yourself, setting an example, but ensuring to the best of your ability that your children or your employees or your co-workers can observe it as well. And again, the practical consideration given to these matters, works of necessity, works of mercy, are always the qualifiers here. So these are not absolute rules, but they are things that are general principles that should be applied. Okay, so any questions or comments there? Observations? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
We got this sort of weird thing in American culture. I mean, it started already like, I don't know, a long time ago, over 100 years ago, where women are almost like the religious heads of the home. Not in the PCA and not in OPC, you know. I think this is a big difference that we have. But in a lot of, you know, even evangelical homes, the mother's sort of the one that kind of makes sure everybody's keeping in line or something. I think that's a big problem, you know, that fathers sometimes are not really the ones that are setting the example. In fact, they might be the one to try to get some work done on Sunday because they're busy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, whatever, and not set the example to their kids and to their wives that, you know, this is really supposed to be.
Yeah, men are all too often eager to abdicate the responsibility which the Lord has entrusted them with. So it's not a great situation. So, if you're responsible for other people, you keep the Sabbath, and you do whatever you can to make sure that they keep the Sabbath. Question 119 now. What are the sins forbidden in the fourth commandment? And this is almost like a photo negative of the earlier question that shows what is required for the Lord's Day. These are all the things that we shouldn't be doing as far as detracting from the Lord's Day. So question 119, which is on page 262, what are the sins forbidden in the fourth commandment? The sins forbidden in the fourth commandment are all omissions of the duties required, all careless, negligent, and unprofitable performing of them, and being weary of them, all profaning the day by idleness, and doing that which is in itself sinful, and by all needless words, works, and thoughts about our worldly employments and recreations. So let's deal with these in four conceptual groups. The four general categories of things that are forbidden. The first would be not doing what we should be doing, or doing them carelessly, slack-handedly. So we should be eager to keep the Lord's Day. We should be eager to observe the spiritual opportunities that are available to us on the Lord's Day, but we should not do them. We're not honoring the Lord's Day if we do them negligently, carelessly, or if we don't do them at all. So that would be the first point that I would make there. The second point of emphasis would be being weary of our Sabbath duties, being weary of them. The book of Amos has an extended indictment of God's people about their hardened hearts and their rebelliousness against the Lord. And in Amos chapter 8, one of the things that the Lord criticizes his people for is that he hears his people saying, "When will the Sabbath be over that we may offer wheat for sale?" They're tired of it. You know, when is this day going to be over so that I can get back and selling wheat and making profit and so on and so forth? That can easily describe us, you know. When can I get out of church so that I can go do what I want to do? And I would suggest that that is the type of weariness of the Sabbath that this question would guard against. Contrast that to what the psalmist says in Psalm 122. I was glad when they said to me, "Let's go into the house of the Lord." So on the one hand, you have a rebellious people saying, "When is this day going to be over?" And on the other hand, you've got the psalmist saying, "I was glad when the Lord's day came so that I could once again be fellowshipping with God's people." So don't neglect them. Don't do them negligently. That's the first thing. Don't be weary in well-doing. Don't be weary in your observance of the Sabbath. That's the second thing. Next, the poet William Wordsworth, like all of the Romantic poets, loved nature, loved celebrating nature, and was always taking these sabbaticals into the countryside where he could commune with nature, get out of the city, get some clean air in his lungs. And he was often accompanied on these excursions by his sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, who was also a poet. And so he celebrates one of these excursions in a poem. And the end of the poem says, he's talking to his sister. He says, "Then come, sister, come what may, with speed put on your woodland dress, and bring no book, for this one day will give to idleness." Now see, that's kind of a secular Sabbath. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to absorb nature. But notice what one of the sins is that is forbidden in the Catechism. Profaning the day by idleness. Profaning the day by idleness. So Wordsworth would have been chided by the Puritans for planning a day where he would just be idle. The Puritans saw the Lord's Day as an active thing. It was not a day of inactivity, but a day of holy activity, a day of holy resting. So we don't want to neglect the things of the Lord. And again, that this does not come down to an exercise where we catalog do's and don'ts. You know, you can do this, but you better not be caught doing that. That's not the point here. But what contributes to a healthy, active keeping of the Lord's Day is what we want to emphasize, and what draws us away from that is what we want to avoid. So that's question 119. Comments or questions there? Yes, sir.
So this is more of an overview question, but is the fourth commandment, can you only break it on the Sabbath?
only break the Sabbath on the Lord's Day? The fourth commandment. That's a good question. Are there any other questions? I would say, well, there is a specific point that will be made in a later question that might address that. But I would say more broadly, for example, the emphasis that is placed earlier about making due preparation so that you are not impeded in observing the Lord's Day because you failed to prepare properly earlier in the week. Or that that would be an example of breaking the fourth commandment, but not necessarily on the Lord's Day. Or conducting your work during the week so that you are forced, perhaps, to be working on the Lord's Day when better performance, better planning could have avoided it. So yeah, I would say it's possible to break the fourth commandment on other days of the week. But there will be another point that is made later in the Catechism. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What about following up on the question about Sabbath rest?
Uh-huh.
Year and about our concept of vacations now? Does any of that roll into this?
Well, there are a lot of challenges. I don't know that I would be able to, somebody might, but I don't know that I would be able to directly connect vacations with Sabbath rest. I know that where to spend this year's vacation was not a prime consideration in this period when the Catechism was, because people didn't, generally speaking, go on vacations unless you were essentially part of the aristocratic class, A sabbatical, yeah. And of course, that's the use of the term that is more broadly symbolic. Like, last week we were talking about the Sabbath rest which Christ has accomplished for his people by his work and then his death and resurrection. But maybe I'm not understanding the question, but it is interesting to think about vacations and which we can call a sabbatical if it's kind of a formal situation. But I'm not sure how I would directly connect that to the fourth commandment. Interesting question. Yes, ma'am. Right. Because that would fall under that necessity and mercy. It would be necessary for you to stay away from worship. It would also be, in some cases, merciful, because if you've got a miserable cold, you wouldn't want to. I'm going to go to church no matter what, and so you're sharing your miserable cold with everybody, so that next week half the congregation is out because they have miserable colds. So that's an example of the mercy and necessity type of qualifier. Okay, so let's go on to the reasons annexed to the fourth commandment, the more to enforce it. Question 120. The reasons annexed to the fourth commandment, the more to enforce it, are taken from the equity of it, God allowing us 6 days of 7 for our own affairs, and reserving but one for himself. In these words, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. 2, from God's challenging a special propriety in that day. The seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. 3, from the example of God, who in 6 days made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. And 4, and from that blessing which God put upon that day, not only in sanctifying it to be a day for his service, but in ordaining it to be a means of blessing to us in our sanctifying it. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So we've got 4 things here. First of all, equity. The Lord wants us to recognize that one day out of 7 belongs to him. It is not unduly burdensome to devote one day out of 7 to the things of the Lord. That we have 6 other days in which to work and to play and to recreate, and there is one day that belongs to the Lord. Just one. Hymn 185 in the Psalter hymnal is a familiar hymn that is usually related to stewardship, to giving of offerings. It starts out, "We give thee but thine own, whate'er the gift may be. All that we have is thine alone, a trust, O Lord, from thee." So when we tithe, we remember that God expects a minimum, 10%, but then we remember that 90% we get to keep. And in the same way, equitably, the Lord says, I want one day out of 7, but you've got 6. So that's what the Catechism is talking about the equity of the situation, that it is not unduly burdensome. And the tendency of sinful flesh is to focus on that dime that I'm giving to God and not remembering the 90 cents that I'm keeping. And the same thing can happen with the Lord's Day. When you get so focused on, oh, I can't do that because it's Sunday, remembering that you've got 6 other days of the week to do what you want to do and what you need to do. So general equity, only one day out of 7. Second, propriety. The Lord's Day is his property. It is something he owns. And so we operate in that context, in an environment of something that does not belong to us but belongs to the Lord. The Lord set an example. He worked 6 days, he rested one day. So we work 6 days and we rest one day. So example. And then the promise of blessing. God has promised to bless the Sabbath day. He meets with his people on the Sabbath day. He has promised, he has made appointments with his people. When the word on the Lord's day is proclaimed from the pulpit faithfully, what has the Lord promised? My word will not return to me void. When we have communion, what has the Lord promised? I will be with you at this table, feeding you, communing with you. When we come to the church on the Lord's Day when there's a baptism, what has the Lord promised by that water of baptism? I will be a God to you and to your children and to all those who are far off. These are promises that the Lord made, and he honors them on his day. So that's that promise of blessing that should encourage us and not see the Lord's Day as a day of burden, but as a day of privilege and joy. Okay, so those are the 4 reasons annexed to the 4th commandment, the more to enforce it. Questions or comments? Yes, sir. Right. Well, the point there is that the Sabbath was made for man's benefit. And so what he was getting at there is, what the Pharisees had done is they called it building a circle around the law. That here was the law, and they were so worried about people violating the law of God, for example, the fourth commandment, that they built a wall of man-made requirements, regulations, to make sure, they said, well, if we make sure that people don't break this, then they will definitely not break this. See what I'm saying? So that was what Christ was criticizing, is that the Lord intended the Sabbath to be a time of spiritual refreshing, but you Pharisees, because of your regulations, have made it a burden rather than a joy. So, but that does not mean that the Lord still does not own the Sabbath. Does that help? Does that help? Okay. Okay, so now we look at a unique feature of the fourth commandment in question 121. Why is the word remember said in the beginning of the fourth commandment? The word remember is said in the beginning of the fourth commandment, partly because of the great benefit of remembering it, we being thereby helped in our preparation to keep it, and in keeping it, better to keep all the rest of the commandments, and to continue a thankful remembrance of the two great benefits of creation and redemption, which contain a short abridgment of religion, and partly because we are very ready to forget it. For that there is less light of nature for it, and yet it restraineth our natural liberty in things at other times lawful, that it cometh but once in 7 days, and many worldly businesses come between, and too often take off our minds from thinking of it, either to prepare for it or to sanctify it, and that Satan, with his instruments, much labor to blot out the glory and even the memory of it, to bring in all irreligion and impiety. So what's going on here is the Catechism wants to unpack this idea of the word remember. And this is the only commandment that starts out by telling us to remember something. The other commandments are saying, don't do this, don't do that. The fifth commandment is to honor father and mother. But here we're told to remember. And what they're trying to do is unpack this to show that it's not just simply a mental exercise, but that the word remember here has a broader application. And of course, this is true in everyday life, right? Because if you say, okay, I'm going to remember our wedding anniversary, that does not mean that you're just going to be able to rattle off the date on which your wedding occurred, right? Although you better do that, that if you forget the date, then you do so at your peril. But when you say we're going to remember our anniversary, what that means is a broader honoring of it, doing something to celebrate it. And the same idea here. When the Lord tells us to remember his day, he's not just simply talking about cognition, about, oh yeah, today's Sunday, this is the day we go to church. That's not what is meant by remembering the Lord's day. So let's take a look at this. First of all, the short abridgment of religion, which is a reference to God's act of creation and God's act of redemption. In Exodus, the fourth commandment is rooted to God's creation activity. The Lord worked for 6 days creating the earth, and on the seventh he rested. In Deuteronomy, the fourth commandment is rooted in God's redemptive work. I brought you out of the house of slavery. Creation, redemption. The Lord's Day celebrates both of those. So that helps us to remember what Westminster calls a short abridgment of religion. Because when you combine creation and redemption, you've basically got the extent of biblical truth. Second of all, there is a readiness to forget the Sabbath for the reason stated here being less light of nature for it. less light of nature for it. Now, what are they getting at there? Well, unlike some other commandments, which by nature present themselves as wrong, murder, for example, being a prominent example, there is less light of nature for honoring the Lord's Day. Now, there may be a little light in our nature that one day out of 7 maybe is a time that we rest, because everyone understands the distinction between laboring and resting. But the idea that there's one day out of 7 that we not only rest, but that we honor and worship the Lord, that's not necessarily something that is evident in nature, the way avoiding murder is evident in nature. So that's what they're saying here. That's what they're saying here. Because there is less light in nature about honoring the Lord on the seventh day, that's why the Lord is saying, you better remember that that's what I want you to do. Nature may show that a day of rest is needed, but not necessarily how the day is to be kept holy. And so that's why we need to remember it. And then the rest of this breaks down, I think, 3 enemies of the Sabbath. You want to put them that way? 3 enemies of the Sabbath. The world. If that's the first one, do you know what the other 2 would be? The world, the flesh, and the devil. That's right. The world, the flesh, and the devil. This question about remembering the Sabbath recognizes that the Sabbath, as required in Scripture, has 3 potent enemies. The world, and we see how our culture, the environment around us, is not intent on treating the Lord's Day as a special day, but treating it as a day like any other. The flesh, our sinful appetites, can work to undermine our need to worship God and fellowship with His people. What is specified there is that one of the ways that our flesh works against Sabbath keeping is that the Sabbath restrains our natural liberty in matters which are lawful on other days. And that gripes us, doesn't it? That gripes us. If I can do it on Tuesday, why can't I do it on Sunday? And there's that fleshly impulse that I should be free, I should have the liberty to do what I want whenever I want to. But the Lord would say, no, remember that one day, something that you may be able to do on Tuesday, shouldn't be doing it on Sunday. You should be focusing on worshiping the Lord, our sinful flesh. And that tendency of the sinful flesh to buck against the Sabbath is one of the reasons why we need to avoid building up a whole panoply of rules, of do's and don'ts about what people can and cannot do on the Lord's Day. Because what that does is stir up people's rebellious spirit, and maybe that's not a healthy thing to do. Do you know the Scottish preacher Eric Alexander? Do you know him? Wonderful preacher and teacher. And he was talking one time about the little village in Scotland where he grew up that had a lot of very strict regulations as far as Sabbath observance. And one of the rules in his village was that you could not whistle on Sunday. You could not whistle on Sunday. And he said that when he was a boy, when morning service was over, he would tell his parents that he was going out for a walk, and he would find a remote part of town and start whistling. And he said, oh, I felt like I was such a devil. And see what can happen if you come up with regulations that are not necessarily related to Sabbath, and then finally the devil can be against the Sabbath. Why would the devil care whether or not God's people worship God on his day? Well, because It's a time where we are strengthened in our bonds to God and to his people. And also, if Satan can tempt God's people not to honor the Sabbath, then he is telling God's people it's okay to deny God something that is rightly his. And that undermines all of the commandments of God. Because basically what God is saying in his commandments is, you belong to me, you are my people, and I have the authority to tell you what to do and what not to do, which is exactly the point of the Ten Commandments. And if Satan persuades God's people, you don't have to worry about the Lord's Day. That's Old Testament stuff, types and shadows. We're letting Satan say, God does not have the right to tell you what to do. You can put any sorts of other God commandments. I came across some very practical advice in Martin Luther on this topic about resisting Satan. He said, in all dangers, stop arguing with Satan altogether. Do not listen to him, and do not think about him. If you do want to think about the opposite. If he argues about death, think about life. If he argues against the Sabbath, think about the best way that you can honor the Sabbath. So I think Martin Luther was on to something there. So we're out of time, but we did finish the fourth commandment. I want to wrap it up by emphasizing the positive aspects of Sabbath keeping. It's easy, to get tied up in, I can't do this, I can't do that. The Lord wants to restrict my liberty, or however you want to say it. But ultimately, the Lord, as we saw, has promised to bless his day. And so that's what our focus should be, that the more I honor the Sabbath, the more God is there ready to bless me. And so this is a classic text as far as Sabbath keeping, Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. And this is the Lord's challenge to us. This is what the Lord is saying to his people about honoring his day. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord. And I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So instead of holding on to that sense of entitlement to our own pleasure, if we give that to the Lord has promised to bless us, to feed us. So I think that's an appropriate way to close out. Thank you for your attentiveness. We've now finished the first tablet of the law. And it's only been, 8 years that it took us to get through it. And next week we will commence the second tablet of the law, starting with the fifth commandment. Chuck, can I have you close us in prayer, please?